Is this possibly a break in the case? There was a SWAT raid, which I was actually at. They went into a neighborhood about 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's house in Tucson, and they detained a man and a woman from the house, and they also detained a man from a traffic stop at a Culver's restaurant very close to that house.
That night, everyone thought everything was still normal, until one small detail made the entire case take a different turn. Reporter Brian Enton was not standing in front of the house where Nancy Guthrie disappeared, and he was not at the front door, where the first signs were found. Instead, he appeared at another house, not the center of the story, but possibly the place holding the most important missing piece. Then something even stranger happened. Federal investigators arrived there with unusual focus. It did not look like a random check or a routine procedure. It looked like they were searching for one specific thing, something they may have already been pointed toward. That made the public uneasy and forced one direct question. Did someone know this was going to happen before it happened? And if the answer is yes, then this is no longer just a mysterious disappearance, but a chain of events that may have been planned in advance. However, before we go further, it is important to make one thing clear. This video is built entirely from information that has already been made public in the news data that appeared during the investigation and analysis for educational purposes. By comparing the timeline, the goal is not to accuse any individual, and not to decide who is right or wrong without official confirmation. The only thing we are doing is looking back at the small details, because sometimes the truth starts to appear exactly where almost no one is paying attention. During the first several weeks, public attention was focused almost entirely on the easiest details: to see the syrup stain near the front door, the doorbell camera suddenly losing signal, the medical device recording the moment it stopped, connecting, and especially the 4-1-minute gap that made every theory more complicated. But among all that data, there was one quieter question mentioned, less often, yet carrying special weight in any investigation. Who was the last person confirmed to have seen Nancy alive? According to public information, the person who drove her home that night was her son-in-law at around 9:50 p.m. It sounds like a very small detail, almost completely normal in family life. But in investigative thinking, the last person to see the victim is always a point that cannot be ignored. That does not mean a conclusion or an accusation. It is simply the starting point for checking the timeline. Because emotions can be wrong, stories can change, but time usually leaves very clear traces. And the timeline, it does not know how to lie. The content in this video is for informational and reference purposes only. Although it has been cross-referenced with reputable sources, some details may have changed or may not be entirely accurate. From that point, the timeline starts to become clearer, but also harder to ignore. Around 9:50 that night, Nancy was brought home a detail that seemed to close out a normal day. But by 1:47 inches the morning, data recorded someone with their face covered standing at the front door. And after that, the doorbell camera stopped working. Then around 2:28 a.m., the medical monitoring device no longer continued sending signals like before. When placed next to each other, these time markers create a gap of nearly 4 hours, not too long, but enough to make anyone following the case stop and think. During that time, many things could have happened: movement, preparation, a change of plans, or simply technical interruptions. However, what makes this timeline important is not each detail by itself, but the way they connect together. When the data points begin falling out of rhythm in a consistent way, the feeling of random becomes harder to believe. And right at the point where what is known meets what is missing, the biggest question appears again: is this only coincidence, or is this a chain of events that needs to be examined more carefully with logic instead of emotion? And right here, let us pause for 1 second. When you look at this entire timeline, which side do you lean toward more random? Everything is simply a series of coincidences, technical problems happening at the wrong time, accidental gaps appearing by chance. Or root, everything already had a path, and each moment was not random, but part of something planned. This is not a question to decide who is right or wrong. It is simply the way each person reads the same data from a different angle. Because sometimes your first perspective decides how you understand the entire case. So what do you think? Random or root? Comment just one word. After the question of random or root attention, return to another detail that was even harder to ignore: the second house. Brian Enton was not only standing near the main scene where Nancy was believed to have disappeared, but was also following several other related locations during the investigation. And among all those places, one house made the public stop and look longer. Not because the images were dramatic, but because of how investigators appeared there. They arrived with unusual focus. Some items were taken outside. The way they searched did not feel like a routine procedure or a formal step of verification. It felt like they came with a clear target, as if they already knew they were looking for something very specific. That changed how many people saw the entire case. The most important thing here is not the question of what was found, because up to this moment there has been no official announcement confirming that. What matters more is how they searched. An investigation's method sometimes says more than results. When investigators return to a place with that level of focus, it often means they are trying to connect a new missing piece to an old story, a detail that once seemed unrelated but could be the thing that changes the whole timeline. But if the second house was a physical step in the investigation, then the real blind spot may be in the technology. Was the interruption of the doorbell camera simply a technical failure, or was there intentional interference from a signal jammer? Some people raise the possibility of a signal jamming device. If that theory has any real basis, then the story no longer looks like a sudden or random act. Because devices like that do not just appear by accident in anyone's hands, they require prior research preparation, and most importantly, a clear understanding of how the home security system works. To interfere at exactly the right moment, that person would need to know where the cameras were placed, which angles were easiest to monitor, which entrance drew the least attention, and even the daily habits of the people inside. That is why in many discussions, the idea of familiarity with the house keeps coming up as something worth thinking about. People who know the house often see things strangers do not even know exist. However, it must be clearly said that this is still only one direction of analysis based on logic, timeline, and public data, not an official conclusion from investigators. Asking questions is not the same as making accusations. Questions are simply a way to see the unanswered gaps more clearly. A question is not an accusation. When we connect all of those observations together, we arrive at an even more controversial piece of the puzzle: the ransom messages, where language accidentally reveals more than the words themselves. If this information is fully verified, it would not just be a normal search action, but could become an important link in the entire timeline. Because what matters is not simply that someone looked at images of the outside of the house, but the reason behind that action. Why did they need to look again at the front of the house? To become familiar with the location, to check the camera positions, to study the least noticeable way to approach, or simply to confirm one small detail from the street view? If this was a complete stranger, that action could be understood as a step of preparation before approaching. But if it was someone already very familiar with that place, someone who had been there many times, who knew the paths, the blind spots, and the daily routines, then it carries a completely different meaning. Why would someone familiar need to search for the address of a house they already knew so well? That contradiction is what makes the question more unsettling. Were they looking for directions or checking something before everything happened? From those image searches, attention shifts to another part that is even more debated: the ransom messages. In many cases, these are not just tools for pressure, but places where language accidentally reveals more than the message itself. A complete stranger usually has to guess many things: how the family will react, who has the power to make decisions, who will panic most easily, and who will be the first person willing to pay. But for someone already familiar with the family, everything is different. They do not need to guess because they already know. They know who is the easiest person to pressure, which words will create the strongest emotional response, and how to make fear appear in exactly the right place and at exactly the right time. That is why many investigators do not read a ransom note as just a message, but as a kind of psychological evidence. The choice of words, the way pressure is created, even what is said and what is intentionally left out, all of it can reflect how close the sender is to the receiver. It is not evidence you can see with your eyes, but sometimes it is the clearest trace left behind. All of these psychological signs seem to point in one direction. But right here, another major question appears: why has the FBI remained completely silent for so long? For the public, silence is often understood as a sign of failure, as if investigation is standing still and nothing new is happening. But in reality, especially in sensitive cases with many layers of overlapping data, silence can be part of the strategy itself. Releasing information too early can push the investigation off track, give involved people the chance to change their behavior, adjust their statements, or even remove the last remaining traces. Sometimes, keeping information private is not about hiding the truth, but about protecting the process of finding it. Just because the public cannot see progress does not mean nothing is happening. Behind that silence, DNA may still be under analysis device, data may still be compared, and multiple sources of information may be checked at the same time to avoid mistakes. In cases like this, the truth rarely arrives with a loud sound. Sometimes silence itself is the loudest thing in the room. And inside that silence, another kind of pressure begins to grow: psychological pressure. If someone truly knows more than they have admitted, time does not make them feel lighter. It usually creates the opposite effect. Every day, the news continues. The FBI keeps working quietly. Data is still being analyzed, searches continue, and the public keeps asking questions. All of that creates an invisible but very real pressure. In investigations, the truth does not always appear from one huge piece of evidence or one direct confession. Many cases begin to change because of very small mistakes: a statement that does not match the timeline, an unusual reaction to a simple question, or one tiny detail that seems unimportant but cannot be explained logically. Long-lasting pressure often causes people to lose perfect control. And at that moment, the things hidden the longest sometimes become the clearest. Some cases are not opened by a big door, but by a very small crack created by the very person who believed they had hidden everything long enough. Few people realize that behind the wall of silence from investigators, another strategy may be working: psychological pressure. As time passes, silence does not bring peace. It creates invisible pressure that makes even the smallest cracks begin to show. Is it Cam, the doorbell camera removed at the most sensitive moment? Is it Devis, the medical monitoring device suddenly losing signal, leaving behind a difficult gap to explain? Or is it Statement, the account from the last person confirmed to have seen Nancy alive, where every minute in the timeline carries its own weight? In cases like this, the truth rarely hides in the loudest detail. It usually hides in the smallest one, the detail ignored the longest because everyone thought it did not matter. So, in your opinion, which piece matters most? Comment just one word: Cam, Devis, or Statement. After more than 80 days, this is still not a forgotten case, and it is certainly not a file quietly closed and left behind. Everything is still moving slower than the public expected, quieter than what the media can see, but still moving. And sometimes the truth does not appear through a shocking confession or a dramatic arrest. It begins with very small things: a timeline that no longer matches, a camera removed at exactly the right moment, a device suddenly losing signal, a house searched again with unusual focus. Those details may seem disconnected, but they could be the road leading to the biggest answer of all. Because in the end, the question is still there, unchanged, still waiting. Who knew before that night that nothing would ever be the same again?